If your money talked, what secrets would it tell? And that book was written, I wrote that book, it took me over 3 years, and Linda was my editor. By the way, Linda and I had agreement a long time ago that we would never work together, and there was a really good reason for that. And unfortunately, I broke that rule, and it was painful. She's tough, and I write one way, she thinks another way. It was very interesting how we finally got this book together, but it came together very nicely, and that's only because Linda was patient with my stream of consciousness writing. Anyhow, the reason I wrote this book was 100% because I was so frustrated with how people handle money. I just couldn't take it anymore. I just thought, this doesn't make any sense. Why don't these people know? And then I realized there isn't any place for them to go and understand money. People don't teach money. They don't have classes in school. They don't have, a lot of places, people don't have parents to help them, and if they do, they're bad role models anyway. And so pretty much everything they're learning is from God knows where. So that was one of the reasons I wrote the book. And what has happened after that has been quite fascinating to me, and actually quite surprising. The book is nothing more than simple principles. And what has occurred since I wrote the book is I've been on over 65 radio stations across the country, interviews, and I've had more than 1.5 million people hear me on the radio. And I've been on some pretty interesting shows. I was on the Jim Bohannon show out of Washington, D.C. I've been on the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Wrap. I've been on stations all over the country, but two of my favorites are very interesting. I'm on Relevant Radio, which is Catholic radio. It's a broadcast worldwide, and I'm a regular guest on Catholic radio. I've probably been on 6-7 times since we did the book, maybe more. And I'm also a regular guest on Christian Broadcasting, the What's Up show, Terry Lowry show out of Houston, Texas, which is also on Sirius Radio. And I'm a regular guest on his show all the time. And it's really interesting because last time I checked, I'm still Jewish. But it was a very fascinating experience to be talking to these people. We've had very good dialogues, and it's been fun. We've had wonderful questions called in. They're very good to talk to. So that's been an interesting side effect, a side benefit that I hadn't expected. Speaking engagements. I've probably done 10 speaking engagements since this all happened. I've gotten in front of people that I would have never gotten in front of. I've done Rotary talks and library talks and cultural center talks. I've been Lake Chautauqua, I did a talk there, doing another one this summer. And it's very interesting who's in the audience and what's happened after that. And then there's some other things that happen, but I got a couple stories to tell you about this before we get to that. So a couple things happened that were very unique. In writing the book, I really didn't know if I'd written a good book or not. And so I engaged a friend of mine to help me with this. And what we decided to do is send 20 books out to 20 people I didn't know. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I didn't want people that were biased and that knew me would say, oh, that's a great book, Gary, when it wasn't. I wasn't interested in that. So Jim agreed to do that, and he sent 20 copies out. And the 20 copies out went out to a variety of people. Well, anyway, one of the books came back, or one of the book reviews came back from a guy named David Coleman. And I never met David Coleman in my life. Man, I love David Coleman, because that was the best review I ever thought I would get. Anyway, it turns out David Coleman is also the dating doctor, which I had never heard of, the dating doctor. But the dating doctor travels college campuses and talks about dating and college and sex and all that kind of stuff. And I get an email from him, and he sends up and he says, I want you to come up Akron U. I'm going to be speaking, and I'd like you to come up and bring about 40 books with you. I said, okay. So Linda and I went up to hear him, and we walk into E.J. Thomas, which is a performing arts center. There's 600 college students waiting for David Coleman to get up and speak. David Coleman is a rock star in the college circuit. This guy is popular, and he's funny, he's witty. I would send my kid to hear him. It was that worthwhile. I would go hear him again. He was very enjoyable. But anyway, he gets up there and he starts and he says, wait a minute, before we get going, he said, I have to stop the program for a minute. And he said, I know all of you are here because of sex and dating. And he said, and I get that. And he said, believe me, I know that's very important. He said, but after that's all over, You're really going to wish you understood money. And then he picked up my book and said, this is the best book I've ever read about money. And the guy that wrote it's sitting right there, and he'll sign these for you as soon as we're done. And then he put my book down. 3 people wanted my book. Anyway, they were more interested in sex and dating. But anyhow, it was still very cool. Another thing that happened is that in the process of this, I couldn't find a publisher. And I didn't really like the publishers I was talking to. So I decided that I would self-publish. And thus that meant I was going to self-print. So I had a conversation with a guy at a company. I had probably 20 conversations actually, but I honed into one. And my conversation was with a guy named Tim. And he works for a printing company called Bookmasters, which is a large national printer. And we have an interview. And Tim says, what are you going to do? And what are you writing? So I tell him I'm writing a personal finance book, and it's going to be hardback. And he said, well, it's a lot cheaper if it's paper. And I said, now we're going to do hardback. He said, well, it's like $3 a book less expensive. I said, I'm not worried about that. I said, we're going to do paper. He says, we're not going to do paperback. We're going to do hardback. He said, why? I said, well, ego. I said, if I took all this time and effort to put in a book, I'm going to print this sucker in hardback. And then we started talking about how many books should we print. And I asked him. I said, Tim, how many books should I print? And Tim said, well, between 250 and 500. I said, okay, why? He said, well, here's what will happen if you're like most of the authors we work with who no one knows about. He said, let me get my facts straight. Does anyone know you? I said, yeah, my mom. He said, okay, we're good to go. He said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to give or sell about 50 of them. The other 200 will go in your basement. I laughed. I thought it was pretty funny. And Tim said, I wasn't being funny. And I said, okay. He said, I was being serious and I was trying to save you some money. I said, what? Oh, that's bad. I appreciate that. And then I said, what about 500? He said, well, that's easy. How big's your basement, Gary? And then I laughed again. And then he said to me, well, how many books were you thinking about printing? And I said, between 2,500 and 3,000. And there was dead silence on the phone. And then he came back on and he said, Gary, I could hear him say, wow. And I said, wow, what? He says, I'm just thinking about how big your basement must be. So that's it. So what did I get out of the book? Well, 3 things happened. Number 1, I was always pretty confident, but I became more confident. I mean, it really did, and it just changed people's perception of me. And it put me through a bunch of new audiences, put me in front of people that I never ever knew or would meet, and all of a sudden they're coming up, talking to me, asking me questions, and it's been really interesting what's happened with that. The new audiences has also led to some interesting conversations. But let me give you one conversation that was really interesting. Early in the process of the book being published and done, I ran into a fellow who has $250,000 with me. He's had it with me for probably 5 years. And he said, Gary, I understand your book's out. I said, yes, it is. He said, I want 3 copies. I said, okay. So I got him 3 copies. He gave me $45. And that was it. Didn't think much about it. About 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from John. And John says, Gary, he said, I want to meet you for breakfast. I said, okay. So we meet for breakfast. We're sitting talking. And he asked me what's new, and I started telling him about angels on the street. And he doesn't say much. He just was listening, asked a few questions, and I told him about that. And then he turned to me and said, you know what's really interesting? I said, what's that? He said, you know that whole thing with the beaver dot thing that started over? And I said, yeah. He said, that was me. I said, you've got to be kidding me. And he said, no. He said, it was me and my brother and my brother-in-law. We put the money in to start Beaver Dot. I said, unbelievable. So that was really weird. Anyway, so we're sitting there talking a little bit more, and I'm just floored. And then he turns to me and he says, Gary, said, I got to ask you a question. I said, what's that? He said, I'm going to write you a check, and I want to know who to make it out to. I said, what are you going to write me a check for? He said, well, I sold my business a while ago, and I've got some cash, and I want to give you a check for $3 million. I said, John, what? And he said, I want to write you a check for $3 million. By the way, I've never had anyone write me a check for $3 million. So I was kind of floored, and I said, why? And he said, well, the truth of the matter is, he said, I read your book, and I really liked how you think about money. And he said, and I decided that I wanted someone like you to have some of the money that I made from this business sale, and that's why I'm going to write you a check for $3 million. Who do I make it out to? And I said, well, you don't make it out to Gary Sirak because they put me in jail, but I will get to the right paperwork and we'll do it the right way.